All right.
Should be good now. Okay, Saeed said that he is emailing Professor Hutchinson, and hopefully we can get him back in a minute or so. But we can just go ahead and get started a while, if that's okay with the two of you.
Sure.
Sure. Do we have an audience?
Yeah, I think we're live
No.
on YouTube. So
Oh, we are live because it says audience 0 under participants. Is it? So we could talk. I mean,
hmm. Okay, we're just gonna go ahead and get started. So
Okay.
I think we have a few people on the stream now. So, okay. So my name is Eric. I'm a senior. I'm a computer science and math double major with a minor in religious studies, and I will be moderating today. Can the both of you just introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about how things have been going for you lately with online teaching, and then kind of how your area of research kind of fits into this whole situation?
are you doing the psychology one? Because the psychology one should probably go first. I don't know your field now.
American politics, no. So I can lead us off.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well,
Yeah, so
if you want, I could start with.
So I'm Professor SoRelle. I'm in government and law. I teach American politics and public policy. And here at Lafayette, most of what I teach revolves around campaigns and elections, how public policies get made and what happens after they do, and then classes on political economy and inequality. So that's what I can talk to you all about today.
Okay, great.
My name's Professor Michael Kelly. I teach in the economics department. I teach mostly finance and some economics, and mostly about market behavior. In terms of teaching, it's certainly strange to be able to just sort of change your entire syllabus on the fly and focus it on, probably one of the most rapidly evolving liquidity crises that we've ever faced, coupled with a recession that will be rather spectacular in terms of its depth and severity. I do include in that a fair amount of behavioral finance. So there was a generic question I was asked, and I'll discuss it later. But the issue is a lot of the issues in finance are residing kind of up here. Rather than in some type of variable in the marketplace. So we'll talk a bit about that.
Okay, great. Can the two of you talk a little bit about how you specifically have had to adapt your curriculum and the way that you teach in this era of, remote education?
Sure. So, I mean, I think obviously we're dealing with a lot of the things that most sort of faculty and students across the country are dealing with. Trying to transition a syllabus on the fly and assignments and group work, and a couple of the classes I'm teaching are writing intensive, and normally we do a fair bit of peer review and workshopping, and so trying to move on all of that online has been a fun adventure. But I think honestly, for me, the thing that has been the sort of silver lining of this is, I'm teaching 3 courses right now. One is on Intro to U.S. Politics, one is on Inequality in the American State, and one is on American Political Economy. And what's unfolding right now is very much in line with all of the things we're trying to learn in each of these 3 courses. And so it's made for a really interesting way to sort of change our syllabi around a little bit and try and think about how it is the things we're learning in class, whether it's about the Depression or the recession in 2008, or inequality and social welfare policy, or how elections work, right? We're sort of seeing some, really significant issues unfold in real time that map onto all of these theories we have in political science about what should happen, how things work. And so, I would say the thing that has been sort of good about this is being able to, adapt our syllabi kind of midstream to be able to talk about what's going on in the world and trying to understand that as much as we can with how quickly things are changing. So, aside from trying to see everyone, with their video freezing and their internet connections going out, and everyone having sort of crazy things going on at home, that I would say that has been the sort of upside to this.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Can people hear me?
Yes, we
Yes.
can. Welcome, Professor Hutchinson. Great to have you.
Finally, great to be here. I've been enjoying the discussion so far. So I thought the comments have been profound. I just couldn't connect.
Well, we're glad that you finally were able to get on with us. Could you just give you a quick introduction about how you've been, kind of managing the shift to remote learning, and then how, your areas of research specifically are relevant to what's going on right now?
Yeah, great. In many respects, I'm teaching a seminar now on the entrepreneurial foundations of economic development. And in that, it is a theory of looking at how markets respond to disequilibria. So the whole idea is to look at how society respond to disequilibrium, to disruptions. So in many respects, having this disruption in the middle of the semester was perfect for what my class does. So we decided to use it as an example of what it is like to engage in what we call the entrepreneurial discovery process. How do you recognize resources as not being fixed but malleable? How do you search for opportunities to create value in the middle of disruptions? So what it has done, it has allowed me to actually make my students get a practical look at what it means to find new value, your value point, your value processes, in the middle of disruptions, and how to essentially not be spooked by it, but to actually see it as an opportunity to create new kinds of value. So yes, my classes, I've been very excited about my classes. I've challenged my students to climb the hill with me. And for my research, it is perfect because as I'm speaking to you now, I'm speaking, I'm with Baltimore. I just finished working with Appalachia, and I'm continuing to work with Jamaica. And so I'm seeing the patterns, the similarity between their readiness or their lack of readiness or their capacity to be ready to deal with disruptions. And so in all three situations, we are looking at the opportunity to value create in the middle of disruptions. So it's an exciting time for the nature of the work that I do, the nature of my scholarship, my public scholarship, which is collaborative knowledge making with, for, and about communities. It's an opportunity to reassign and redesign the way value is created, to move away from product wealth to community wealth as a way of building resilient spaces for dealing with disruptions like what we're facing now. So yes, it's an exciting time for the nature of the work that I do.
All right, well, thank you for the introduction. Professor Kelly, do you have any comments on how you shifted your classes in the last couple of weeks?
Well, the first thing is in the spring semester, I primarily teach seniors in my investments and futures and options classes. And they, sort of, second semester senior year, it's supposed to be sort of a very fun time in their lives. And now, yeah, they're all basically in their childhood bins or some dorm rooms, or some people are actually, one person's having to actually access via over a smartphone. It's clearly, sort of their lives have been upended. Some of them already have jobs, and those they've been told what's going to happen. I don't think I know anyone who's lost a job offer. Nonetheless, they'll be working remotely, et cetera. And, when you're trying to convince people that what you're doing is still relevant, you want to learn from it, you just want to change things up a bit. So once a week, I've been having guest speakers come in from the industry who've been involved with what's going on. And lo and behold, they're all available because they're all sitting at home. And talk to them about the thing about an event like this is it brings out many things that don't matter until they're the only thing that matters. And so you could go through years and years of working and get some kind of contingency plan on a shelf somewhere or on a thumb drive or whatever somewhere about this. But generally, it's abstract. And then all of a sudden, that thing becomes the only thing. And try to steep them in that experience to sort of see exactly how people think about liquidity versus insolvency, or think about the policies that are being implemented by the Federal Reserve, of how actually they are actually unprecedented, even relative to the financial crisis, and sort of the behavior of market participants. It's really been, for me, I'm a little bit of a kid in a candy shop, but I understand that this has real world implications for my students, for me as well, for my family, for many families in this country. So it's kind of a very real thing.
Yeah, thank you for that. Professor SoRelle, I wanted to ask you a question that's, I feel, has become very salient recently. We've seen, things happening with the Wisconsin primary, and, this kind of debate of like, do I go out and cast my ballot or not? Some states refusing to do mail-in voting. Pennsylvania has pushed back its primary and is allowing for mail-in voting. What does this mean for our election? And especially if we get to the point where it's November and we still have to have these measures in place, what does that mean kind of for the integrity of an election?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that there are a couple of different ways to answer it. So, one thing that we might see, and in fact that we are seeing some places that, may come out of this, are policymakers saying, well, we need to have an election, and all of these, things that we have in place that we think might make voting easier for people, but for various reasons have chosen not to pursue in the past, like vote by mail, right? Or perhaps more flexible voting, even more flexible registration procedures, right? If we think about something like online registration. We're seeing some places say, well, I guess we're just going to go ahead and do that. We're going to go ahead and roll that out because we don't have a choice, and this is the sort of safest way to vote from a public health measure. So we could imagine, and I think we will continue to see, states moving forward with some of these election reforms that scholars, sort of depending on the reform, scholars think are likely to increase turnout. There's some questions about who they increase turnout for, but that we might think of as being sort of pro-expansive democracy, right? The flip side of that is, we also see states like Pennsylvania saying, we're going to push our primary back. When it comes to something like a primary election, that's maybe not necessarily a huge deal, in part because the parties themselves kind of set the primary calendar. And so there's always some flexibility from election to election when these are held. What I think starts to make some political scientists a little bit nervous is when we start to see anything that makes it easier to push off an election or to justify not having an election, or not having an election that is accessible to all voters, or things like that. That starts to make political scientists a little bit nervous, right? And so, I think there is a very real question, is there a scenario in which something, right, like a public health crisis, a pandemic, becomes a tool to sort of shutter democracy in some important ways? And I think part of what we're seeing so far is that both of those things are happening. Because in the US, for the most part, states are in charge of their own election laws, we can see sort of 50 different approaches to this. And, in ways, in dramatically different ways that are meant both to expand and sort of close off sort of who has access to voting. But the flip side is there's a real public health crisis, and you can't have thousands of people standing in line next to one another with vulnerable poll workers. And in the US, when you look at poll workers, most of them are older. Good reason for young people to go out and volunteer to be poll workers. Like, not, don't put your health at risk, but just generally.
The young people can go and get the virus, yeah.
Not what I meant. But, it raises some really interesting questions about our election infrastructure, I would say. So.
Yeah, so I guess then, like, where does that leave us as far as legitimacy goes? I mean, there's already enough questioning of the 2016 election, and like questioning the Electoral College, and within the last few years, seeing like a lot of electronic voting machines being used in like the midterms and in primaries, and the legitimacy of those being questioned.
Yeah.
I feel like this all just kind of gets compounded by not being able to be near each other.
Yeah, one of, I think, actually the biggest concerns of all of this is the rhetoric around legitimacy in elections, and this really picked up a lot in 2016, and prior to the election, when people were asking, still then candidate Trump, like, will you accept the results of an election if you don't win? And he's kind of like, we'll see. One of the things that scholars have found is that, when we start to hear more rhetoric that questions the legitimacy of elections, whether it's grounded in fact or not, that can tend to have a depressing effect on turnout, right? So when you tell people that their vote doesn't matter because elections are rigged, shockingly, many voters think, oh, I guess I won't waste my time and stay home. So, to me, I think that in some sense is the more significant but concern. A lot of the things that when things like voter fraud occur, they typically occur on the side of people running elections, not people voting in them. Even that, tends to still be quite rare. And so, I think we tend to have a sense in the US of the ways that our elections are vulnerable. And certainly there are ways that our elections are vulnerable, as anyone who's kind of been paying attention to intelligence reports around this knows. But from the perspective of the average voter, it's hearing over and over people saying, well, how can we even trust what's happening? That at the end of the day can, I think, have an even more significant effect, because it makes people want to stay home. And then you can question the legitimacy of elections, the fewer people who show up to participate in them. So.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
My next question, I think, would kind of split between Professor Hutchinson and Professor SoRelle here. So, we've been seeing a lot of kind of rhetoric about We all have to stay home to help each other, but not everyone can stay home. We have, the essential worker now, which I've seen a lot of companies and a lot of people kind of going out of their ways to describe them and call them heroes as a way to kind of make it seem like they're like taking the blame, I guess, away from the corporations that are putting them in those positions and not providing them with proper masks or protective equipment. I saw something earlier today that Amazon was giving workers shirts that said hero on them, but not giving them hazard pay. So Professor Hutchinson, I guess what is happening to these more vulnerable sectors of the economy, and how does that kind of tie into the work that you do? And then to Professor SoRelle, how does that affect social welfare initiatives? We see unemployment offices being completely backed up with claims. I think we're over 20 million claims nationwide this week. And what does that say about kind of the way that we'll treat social welfare programs going forward?
Yeah. So I'd like to tie both things together into a larger observation that I've had.
Please do.
In the work that I do. I thought your last question to Professor SoRelle was quite interesting, and I tell you why. I believe that the most important asset, the most valuable asset anyone has anywhere is their right to vote. And the evidence of that in the United States is how hard people in power worked to deny people who don't have power, deny them their right to vote. So it was you had to be able to read the Bible to vote, or you had to own land to vote, or you had to, you were not a full citizen to vote, or you can travel to Jamaica, you see the same kinds of things that screen people out from voting, and if you have been convicted of a prison, you can't vote. You saw in Ferguson, where when the Department of Justice did their study, they admitted to, from the African-American kids were 16, they started to tack them with small crimes. So by the time they got to be 18, they had lost the right to vote. And so you had a police force that was significantly different in complexion and power than the folks that they were doing. So the right to vote is really important. It's the most important asset. And what's extraordinary is that if we take, and I will tell you my thesis on all this, but let me tell you an observation first, that if we look at the places where that franchise, that ability to vote, has never been presented in a contestable way. So I work in areas of Appalachia where they have always voted one way for 30, 40 years. I work in Maryland in a city where they have only voted one way forever. So, and the irony of those situations, and I can go to Jamaica and I can find communities that only vote one way forever. And the irony of all of those communities that have always voted one way forever is that they are the ones that are most vulnerable and most being destroyed by coronavirus or by any trend in the economy. Not only have they not exercised their franchise in a very contestable way, they have been marginalized and ignored as a result of people taking for granted that they don't have to compete for their votes. So it doesn't matter if I go one area and I see that they always vote, they're going to vote for Trump, or I go another area, they're going to vote us, and I can take it for granted. Where I worked in Appalachia and in Maryland, here is the difference. One area has the highest crime rate in America. They vote Democrat for the last 50 years. They have a significant drug addiction problem. They have significant dependence on the state, and they are mostly Black. The other area is mostly white. They voted 80% for Trump. They have a high drug addiction problem. They have the highest, among the highest suicide rate in the problem in America. And in both cases, the crimes in one, 80% is committed by gun. And in the other one, the suicide rate 80% of the suicide is committed by gun. So if you were just to remove the political landscape and you look at how marginalized they are, how disempowered they are, how lack of power they are, then you understand why a pandemic affects them, because they have no internal agency or capacity to defend themselves. Amartya Sen, one of his most famous works that was leading to his Nobel Prize, was that when democracy is active and profound, you can't have not a pandemic. What do you call it now? This a famine. You could not have a famine because people would be able to exercise their franchise to vote and force government to intervene early on and throughout. So the idea of you having the same communities that are now devastated by coronavirus were the same communities that were devastated by the Great Recession. They lost their wealth. Doesn't matter whether we're talking about poor whites or poor blacks. They completely lost their wealth. That's the same community that when we started the computerization from the late 50s, and it was triggered by the oil crisis and the 1980s coming out with the computerization, they are the ones that got a freezing in their wages as the inequality worsened. They're also the ones now, which now at the fourth industrial revolution is going to be hastened by coronavirus. And we're now going to be moving to artificial intelligence, robotics, data science. They're also the ones that are also going to be seen that they're going to be more further marginalized in this process. So to me, there's an issue of you can vote and an issue of how you exercise that franchise to ensure that you have the ability to influence outcomes that engage you in mutually beneficial exchange. It has to mean something. So I will just say my general thesis in all of this, right, in the work that I do, is that for us to begin to regain the ability to build community wealth, to build community ability to have the capacity to transform themselves, not paternalism where they now depend on government, right? The average family in where I was in Appalachia got 44,000 worth of government assistance and so on and so forth. And so you had a perverse incentive for them to fail to succeed. And so for us to create where they have the dignity of agency and the dignity of working collaboratively and cooperatively for their own empowerment, I begin by saying that franchise to vote, it has to be taken seriously. And for me, that means it has to be contestable. Nobody is entitled to it. People got to make a case as to why they are deserving of that franchise. And it's ironic that the places that it is never in doubt how they're going to vote are the places where I also see being most marginalized. It doesn't matter whether I look in Honduras or in Jamaica or across America. And I therefore am arguing that in preparing for the trends, which didn't start with coronavirus, but actually started 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And this was the underbelly of America that we saw. Doesn't matter whether it was SARS or the Great Recession or now this. What is happening now is just a hastening of an underlying trend which has been going on and has never been addressed. And I don't understand how you have your franchise of a vote and you don't use that to ensure that the things which are undermining your community are addressed. And so I will stop there, right? But I'll just say one thing. We're celebrating now the Freddie Gray uprising in Baltimore, right in Pennsylvania and North, which it led to all this burning down and all these things. This was 2015. In 2020, every statistic of the quality of life and well-being in that area, West Baltimore, has deteriorated. So what was the gain of the demonstration and the and the protests and the actions that occurred after you got this national attention for the way in which your life has not been treated with dignity and proper commitment. And so I would start from there, and my work in economic development would start from how do we build enterprise and community wealth and individual wealth and agency and empowerment so that they can own and ensure that they're not marginalized going forward. And that is the nature of the work that I do, whether it is in Appalachia, which Professor Kelly was with me on, or in Honduras, or in Jamaica, or now in Baltimore, and I'm looking at some places in Mississippi, and Wisconsin, same situation. I will pause there.
All right, thank you very much. Professor SoRelle, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, well, so I'll talk a little bit more specifically about the sort of social welfare policy piece in the U.S. There are a couple of things about the way social welfare policy has developed in the U.S., both historically and in the, sort of in more recent history, that I think just generally raise some very serious challenges for people being able to use that in ways that can sort of help them be socially mobile, and that also make it challenging for us to sort of manage a crisis situation like this. And so there are, I think, sort of three main pieces to this. One is that the US is a federal system, which means that the central government gets to make some decisions and the state governments get to make a lot of decisions. And particularly when we talk about social welfare policies, the vast majority of those historically have been handled at the state level. And in fact, it has really only been in times of national crisis, right? First, the Depression, some of the sort of social unrest in the 60s and 70s, the financial crisis in 2008 sort of remains to be seen now, but where we see the federal government introduce policies that are sort of more universal, and by that I mean that are available to everyone and not just lower income folks, right, who get things sort of for means tested policies, and that tend to be more generous. And so, historically, when you look at policies that come from the federal government when it comes to social welfare, they do tend to be more generous. They tend to be things that are accessible to everyone. So Social Security is a great example of this. Medicare, I mean, obviously there's age, right? But irrespective of who you are, once you hit a certain age, right, you can get these benefits. Compared with things like TANF, right, public assistance, which is handled largely by the states. So we have a history. It is rooted deeply in issues of race and racism, right? Coming out of the Civil War and the Depression, where there were a lot of states who relied on poor Black, Latino, and in places poor white as well, workforces who said, I do not want the federal government coming in and giving generous welfare benefits to these populations. And so states fought to keep control over those programs. And so what we see today is that states vary widely in the generosity of many of these social welfare benefits. And so your ability to weather a crisis like this is often an accident of birth. Do you live in a state where you get access to more generous paid sick leave, right? More generous unemployment benefits, more generous TANF, or sort of policies that come around those. And even the systems used to deploy them, right? If you go out and you look across the states right now, some states are really struggling to meet the demand for unemployment benefits, not just because of the overwhelming number of folks, but because the infrastructure of their programs is not as good as it is in other states, right? Because states are sort of designing a lot of these on their own. So this is one issue we have, that the benefits that are sort of most targeted toward the least well off are largely sort of built at the state level, and that introduces tremendous inequality across states. So that's one issue. The next issue is that sort of more generally in the US since about the 1980s, we've seen policymakers move toward this model of eligibility for social welfare that's tied to your ability to work. Now, that's not in and of itself necessarily a bad thing, but it's happened at a time when when sort of full-time jobs with pension plans and health benefits are disappearing for huge parts of the economy, right? So we're increasingly building these social welfare policies that are premised on the idea that people have access to certain other types of benefits that come with a full-time job at the same period in which fewer and fewer people have access to a full-time job. Right. So there's a sort of mismatch between what a lot of the assumptions about the benefits that people can get, the way we structure policies around those, and what people can actually find sort of in the labor force. And the third piece I think that makes it really challenging for our sort of social welfare system to accommodate all of this is that the U.S. has a history dating back to the New Deal of what a handful of scholars call a credit welfare state. So this idea that in the US, in lieu of having more generous social welfare, like traditional social welfare benefits, the US has embraced a model of expanding access to credit, right? To consumer credit, to housing credit, to student loans, right? And there, as we saw in 2008, that can have some, when so much of that credit is lent on sort of a subprime basis or predatory basis in a lot of communities, that ends up meaning that for people to get access to, in the absence of sort of other forms of social support, if your alternative is private credit, and for a lot of folks at the margins, that credit comes with incredible costs associated with it that really sort of trap folks into a pretty pernicious cycle of debt that makes it really hard to get out of, particularly because most Americans don't have much in the way of savings. That is problematic in the best of times. It is especially problematic in the middle of a potential, massive economic recession. And so, I think what we're going to come out of this seeing is that a lot of people won't be able to get access to the benefits they need. A lot of people don't have access to sort of support through work. And a lot of people are going to be relying on credit that they're going to really struggle to pay off, particularly for folks who are losing their jobs or losing hours or, supporting more people who are now home instead of off, being able to work. And I think we're going to have a lot of questions at the end of this about what are we doing about things like bankruptcy law in the US? What are we doing about wages? So, I think we're not terribly well equipped to handle this from a social welfare perspective. And I think it's going to raise some pretty significant questions for policymakers, sort of when we come out the other side, or hopefully before then, but certainly when we come out the other side.
All right, thank you very much. My next question is for Professor Kelly. So over the last month and a half, we've seen the stock market kind of go all over the place. It's taken a dive and come right back up, and then it's doing great now. But then, you see like the price of oil going negative the other day, and just it seems very sporadic and all over the place. Is it smart to be investing right now?
When you asked the question, you froze. So I'm sorry. What's the question again?
Is it
So right in
smart
the
to be
last sentence.
investing? Is it
Okay,
smart to be investing at a time like this?
So basically, whenever, if I just sort of step back and become more individual to the let's say the student audience, right? So here are college students who are going to graduate. They're graduating from a very strong institute. They spent much of their life essentially building human capital, right? So every year economists call that human capital. Every year they require more knowledge, more skills, more capabilities. And those capabilities could be used for any number of things, but one of those things that's going to be important in their lives that they're going to use those capabilities for is to convert that into financial capital, right? So I grew up sort of lower middle class. So I go to weddings and funerals and meet very large family, 26 cousins just on my mother's side of the family, that kind of thing. And it's usually weddings and funerals, right? That I'll wind up sitting next to one of my cousins, and they'll ask me the generic question, which is very similar to the question you asked, which is this a good time to invest? Or what should I be doing right now in the market? Or what have you, whatever the generic question winds up being. And one of the most important things to understand about that question, and I really sort of pose this as well for the students who, once again, you're going to be forced to become financially educated over the years. You're going to get jobs, you're going to earn money, you're going to build wealth. And so, when you talk to other members of your family, if they're not in that position, if you talk to friends or other people, the first step of that is the question of what should I do in the market right now is not really a question about what I should do in the market right now. It's about there's something going on in their head, right? And I've found everything ranging from, a family member who was subjected to financial fraud, to a family member who is literally just free because of the environment that we're in, to others who are experiencing other things, or just people who are just confused, right? And whenever I answer that question, therefore, I sort of, it's like the first thing I have to do is I have to get them to talk. So you ask the question and it's like, okay, I have to not speak and I have to somehow get you to speak about what's going on. So I start asking very open-ended questions about what's going on in your life and what's happening and how are things and how's so-and-so and how's so-and-so, et cetera. And you have there's a certain level of trust there to begin with. If it's not a family member, I have to sort of build that trust. And then I could usually see what it is, and then I go right back to the beginning. And the beginning is you build human capital and you convert that human capital to financial capital. And then you have to set up your life so that you can save some of that in order to be able to invest. So a lot of people think that they can invest without saving. Usually what they're doing is putting money on their credit card to pay their bills and putting money away in a 401k plan, and that's not saving. That's borrowing money in order to put it into a 401k plan. And then start to talk about their risk tolerance. And this is in some sense what this question is probably closest to. So I'll get to the risk tolerance part of this. If any of the people listening had money in the market last month and watched their wealth decline by 30%, if they had or more, usually those bear markets last around 6 to 9 months. So you kind of had a reprieve. A month later, more than half of the loss is back, especially if you own bonds, which had a horrible time. They were down similar amounts, which you're not supposed to. This must be bonds. You're supposed to get paid. Now they're back to where they started, essentially. How did you react to this? When I talk to my students, for instance, I say, it's that old Mike Tyson quote. Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth, right? Everyone has sort of this, I have this great plan. I'm going to invest in stocks because I know they're giving me the best returns, and I'm just going to ride out the bad times. And bam, comes that punch to the mouth. And how did you feel about that? And for my students, the way I put it to them is, if you wind up waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning spitting up blood, then you might have not really have had the portfolio that meets your risk tolerance, right? So you might not be sort of in that portfolio. And so, for the issue here is really that investing can be a very mechanical thing, except for your head. Investing is saving and putting money away, and then as that money's put away in a portfolio that it's going into that's set up to meet your risk tolerance and not really worrying about it. But of course, we don't not really worry about it. We spend all of our time worrying about environments like this, and then we sell out our risk assets at the exact wrong time, and we do the exact thing that would damage us. So, so if you ask me, for instance, people ask me a lot, how do you feel about the market? And I say, I try not to. And it's not just a joke. It's actually a deliberate strategy. I try not to feel about the market. It's the thing that's going to blow you up. I try not to look at my portfolio every day. I try to look at it no more than once a month. I try not to make decisions I try to delay myself, for instance. I try to say that if I decide that I don't like my risk allocation, I'm going to wait 3 months before I actually implement it. I try to do things to keep how I feel from being what I do. My answer right now, look, is there all this uncertainty out there? Is the Fed buying junk bonds, which makes me want to just smash my head against this keyboard? Yes. It's the nuttiest, craziest thing. The Fed is supposed to be the lender of last resort. In the financial crisis, they became the banker of last resort. They basically guaranteed credit lines. And now they've become the investor of last resort. And for anyone who's involved in the financial markets, that's one of the scariest things in the world. It allows all kinds of potential political influence to be involved. It just is not something we want the Federal Reserve with an unlimited printing press sitting in the Treasury's basement to be involved in. Does that bother me? Yes. Does that make me change my risk profile? Not really. So, my view of it is, so all these things sort of pounding around in my head are actually that can put me on what poker players call tilt, are actually more of the problem than the market problem. So that's sort of a strange answer, but I think it's really the way that we should think about investing.
All right, thank you. I guess I have another question. So that there have been a lot of things that I've seen going around of, farmers having to dump thousands of tons of food and just leave it because they can't sell it. They can't find anyone to buy it. And at the same time, there are food shortages all around the country, and food banks and food pantries are strained more than they've seen in a long time. Do you think that this will kind of serve as a catalyst for some kind of shift in the way that kind of market is run, where there's just fields with tons and tons of food being just dumped because they can't find anyone to sell it to?
So everything exists in a supply chain. Supply chains used to be quite primitive. Somebody brought something somewhere and they brought it into town, or they might have brought it to a port and shipped someplace else. But a lot of things were sourced locally, and so on and so forth. Now supply chains are global, and it's nearly impossible to instantaneously shift the supply chain, and that's what we're sort of seeing right now. The case of toilet paper is the funniest case. Essentially, everyone went to work, used commercial toilet paper at work, which is single ply on those big rolls because they don't want you to steal them and all that other stuff. And all of a sudden, everybody's working out of their house, and they want to buy little rolls that you would typically use in your house, and there aren't enough of them because there's this huge surge in demand for one type of. Essentially, they're not perfect substitutes. We tend to think of toilet paper as being perfect substitutes. It's not perfect. There's commercial toilet paper, there's home toilet paper, and that's requiring a shift in that supply chain. In terms of food, we consumed an enormous amount of food outside of home in restaurants, and there was a very specific supply chain and there are certain regulatory rules around that. For instance, if I buy something in a grocery store, it must have that nutrition label on it. That is not required for restaurants. And so if I were supplying into the chain for restaurants, or if I'm sending eggs to, I don't know if you've ever seen how eggs are sold to restaurants. They're in these really large, open things, with like 36 or more eggs. They're like almost like a pallet of eggs. And that's the way it's said, that's the way I can sell it. I don't have those little 12 egg cartons with the flip top and so on to be able to sell it into the regular market. There's smaller sizes, typically the eggs, because people don't like to buy, they like extra large eggs. There's all of these issues of how things are supplied to the supply chain. And my point to you is it just takes time for it to adjust. And so the question will be, is this a permanent shift or not? firms will sort of say, okay, well, if it's a permanent shift, we have to change the nature of how we package things. Should respond, by the way, by allowing people to sell, obvious products like milk without a nutrition label on it. That's been brought up. Of course, there seems to be absolutely no caring at all about that. We've heard nothing at any level, and that's a federal question that can't be changed at the state level. So what I would just sort of say is it's just going to take time, and the market will do it. Farmers don't like to dump eggs. That's a lot of money.
Yeah, of course.
They'll take care of it. There may be some need for some regulatory changes to help sort of the transition. And then there's also been discussion of whether or not the government can actually even provide some money that would help them not throw that away, but be able to send it to charities and things because they don't know how to, it's like it costs money for the farmer to send it. They lose it to begin with. If you gave them some money, they could give it to the charity. Right. So there's some types of interventions that are possible.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And then I have a question from the audience for Professor Hutchinson. The question is, how do you think COVID-19 will affect voting patterns of marginalized communities in the 2020 election?
That's an outstanding question. My first answer is that it should. It should, and it should because these marginalized communities are now again having a great appreciation of what it means to be disempowered. So they are seeing that COVID-19 effect is not about COVID-19. It's not about this disease that is affecting them. It's about the ecosystem of their well-being that is not in place. It's about the diet. They don't have, there's a food desert. They don't have fresh fruits, right? Because the supermarkets can't keep it stored for long because of the demand. So everything is in cans and with all different kinds of things. So it's about their diet. It's about that the building that they're in, the rent has not been provided enough for the capital upkeep. So the air conditioning system is not clean and it is creating pneumonia. It's about the parks being unsafe so people can't go out and get fresh air and go walk. It's about the job skills problem creating a problem for industry to come in. So when COVID-19 comes in, the problem is really not about COVID-19. It's about, it doesn't matter whether it's the flu every year or it is COVID-19 or it is the lack of a dispute resolution mechanism in these communities so that tension with the police flares up into a major street march and demonstration. And in that environment, you get a divestment. You get a divestment. Capital entrepreneurs divest from that environment unless they are really, really smart. So my answer to your question to Professor Kelly about is this a good time to invest? In the midst of all of this crisis going on, for example, in Baltimore, Elon Musk in 2017 signs a major contract to bring in one of his hyperloops downtown Baltimore, Pennsylvania station. So now you can move from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore in 15 minutes and from Baltimore to New York City Grand Central in half an hour. Because Baltimore has lost, it used to be 1 million persons 20 years ago, it's 600,000 now. So you have all these homes and row homes which are just sitting there. It used to be grand. It was made to design after, Drew Hill Park was designed after Central Park and the streets next to it are Park Avenue and these things. So all of a sudden, what you're now seeing is an area, right, People now can work downtown Manhattan. In half an hour, they can be in a very nice area of Baltimore, Bolton Hill, Drew Hill Park, so on and so forth. They can work downtown DC. In 15 minutes, they can be there. So in the midst of the marginalization taking place, there is a kind of a gentrification that a smart investor is looking on and seeing opportunities to do so. So should marginalized people organize and vote? Yes, but they have to recognize that their vote has consequences. And so when they are mobilized, they must rank what is important for their communities. What is it that they're trying to achieve? They must understand the responsibilities of being granted that agency over their circumstance. And then the irony of it is, once they start owning that process, you'll be surprised to see how private investors actually want to partner with them, knowing that they are as invested in the development of their community as the private investor is invested in that community being a source of the investment of their capital. So what I'm saying to you is, they have to own their experience. And by doing so, they then can negotiate as an equal partner with government and the private sector. But by disenfranchising, by always just making their vote not be contestable, by not making the political having to come and explain what is in this for them, so it can be a mutually beneficial exchange, then I think that they have given up their opportunity to exercise power in transforming their communities. So yes, their vote should count. Yes, they should be invested in being able to organize to do so. And that's their only way of transforming. They can't expect those from the outside to care more about their transformation than they care about their transformation. And so, yes.
All right. Thank you very much. We have one more question from the audience, and then we're going to wrap it up. This question is for both of you. Do you foresee stimulus checks evolving into some sort of universal basic income? And how do you think that this will arise as a political issue after the pandemic?
I make Professor Kelly go first.
Okay. Generally, there's been a fairly dramatic increase in the debt of the U.S. government over the past few months, just over the past few months. And on top of that, the Federal Reserve has dramatically increased both with treasuries as well as bonds. Though they haven't bought as many corporate bonds as they said they were going to buy. But they've dramatically increased their purchase of assets, mostly government debt. I really do believe that no matter how the election works out, the biggest issue that we're going to be facing is how to deal with the massive depression or the recession that we'll be going through, as well as the large amount of debt that we currently have. So I know there are a lot of people out there who don't believe that debt is a constraint, but at some point when debt becomes a constraint, you're in a lot of trouble. So debt's not a constraint until it is a constraint, and then all of a sudden you can't even do the things that you normally do. So something like a universal basic income, which is extraordinarily expensive, whether it's a good idea or not, is probably going to be a bit off the table as we deal with, for instance, retirement of my generation. I'm the youngest of boomers, born in 1964. And when I retire, when I reach full retirement age, when I'm 67 years old in 2031, you'll basically completely locked in the issue, which is how do you pay for the baby boomers' retirement benefits, which are fairly generous. And I know my generation, we're going to vote to make sure that we get to keep our very generous retirement benefits. Given that we already have that sort of freight train coming at us, and on top of that, have just added a substantial amount of data, I just don't really see it being plausible.
Yeah. If I could comment on this. So if I hear the question through my lens, this is what I hear. Okay, in light of the fact that we are now on the threshold of the fourth industrial revolution, where we're moving from computerization to robotics, artificial intelligence, data science, and computers being able to, self-driving cars, self-driving buses. We have to change in the light of the fact that those things are coming on stream. Should we have a universal basic income? So what I hear is, should we have a universal basic transfer? Since an income is associated with payment for value created, payment for engaging in a task. So if these things are coming down the pike and you are not ensuring that the government or industry participate in strengthening your capacity to be an important value creator in the new nature of work, the new industries, for you mastering those skills, not just to be a laborer, but also to be a value creator, an entrepreneur, an inventor, an innovator, an arbitrager in this space. It's not just working for others, but you can be value creator in all these things. If the question was, how do we ensure that there is a mechanism to build our capacity universally to be dynamically value creating in this new space, then it would be a different question than saying, should we have a universal basic income? And that is divorced from, should we have a universal dynamic way of ensuring that we are value creators in the new nature of work? So I would at all times prefer a commitment to enhancing my capacity or people's capacities to be value creators and be able to engage in the dignity of enterprise, the dignity of agency over their lives, being able to take care of their families through their effort and through their value creation, rather than just saying that other value that is created elsewhere, we want that to be shifted to us in a transfer. I don't think that's what people want. People want the dignity of being value creators and the dignity of being an agency over their lives. And I think that is where we now need to have a smart nature of partnerships between government, the private sector, and people and workers and everyone else to try and imagine how this process might develop so that we all are winners and no one is seen as being a free rider in this process. So that's how I hear, and that's a question I respond to.
All right, thank you. We have one more question really quick from the audience. I know we're a little bit over time, but the question is, which sectors of the economy are likely to recover the fastest and which are likely to recover the slowest? And how should policymakers proceed based on that?
I make Professor Kelly go first again.
I guess the way I would answer that is which sectors are experiencing actual sort of change in the value of the capital of that industry, or in the case of finance, insolvency, which are experiencing sort of business failure the most, et cetera, versus the businesses that have been the most resilient. And so the answers, there's obvious to the answers. One obvious piece to the answer is that businesses that have not been as severely disrupted, for instance, ones where much of the work is knowledge-based and something like this works, will not be as significantly impacted, with some exceptions, higher education actually being one of the big exceptions in that. The threat to higher education is dire, actually, if we wind up being online in the fall for it.
Yeah. So
yes.
no, finish.
No, go ahead, Flynn. In other areas, so for instance, people see this, they saw negative oil, for instance. The first thing I like to tell my students is that negative $40 oil occurred nowhere else except in Cushing, Oklahoma, for the settlement of that contract. Right, it was very specific to the fact that, once again, built into the system is oil being produced at a certain level, and that's kind of a decision you make months in. And so when we're hit with this incredible shock and everybody is driving, you wind up having this flood of oil and not enough storage for it. And just in terms of natural gas versus oil, natural gas, you can actually shut off the well and it doesn't really damage anything. If you shut off an oil well, it's very damaging to the production of that well. So people have actually kept producing oil even though they knew it was going to be a very weak environment. In this environment where people are going to have to pay to give the oil away if they don't stop producing oil, they're going to be shutting in those wells. And that's going to have a permanent impact on them. And there'll be a sort of something, there'll be a big sort of bad time period in oil, but oil goes through these cycles, and we'll see 5 years from now that there'll be more drilling and there'll be more innovation in terms of shale and so on in different countries, and the energy business itself, because there's always a certain level of demand for energy. If we get back into our cars again, will be there. So, the types of industries, though, I think, restaurant retailing, you're going to lose more than half of independent restaurants in this country, easily gone. Those people who are entrepreneurs who are going to face the fact that they've gone bankrupt, which does impair their ability to go back to being entrepreneurs again. They might try to, but it impairs them. And so there'll be some permanent shifts in people have learned how to cook that did not plan on it, and they'll find that they'll cook at least more in their home than they used to before, and that'll be a demand shift. So as one thinks through it, there's some sort of obvious questions. The same with vacationing. Who's going to go on a vacation until at least 2 weeks after there's a needle in my arm, right? Until there's a needle in my arm, there are businesses that are fundamentally shut down. And that's going to have a permanent impact on airlines, on hotels, vacations.
Yeah.
So countries that are relying towards. All right. Over to you.
I know. I need. Okay. Are you finished, Kelly?
Yes, I am.
So I don't have to be quick to wrap it up, right? But I will just say that my good friend, Professor Kelly, I disagree with us about everything he said, right? And I tell you why. Right? I tell you why. I mean, if I look at business startups and entrepreneurship, COVID is a disease. The Great Recession was a financial meltdown. By January of this year, business startups on a month-by-month basis had already caught up back and was past where we were before the Great Recession, right? America is a dynamic kind of an entrepreneurial capitalist place, right? And what I'm saying is people are always looking for new ways to engage in new ideas and to create things. So we now know, good, robotics, anything that humanizes social media, right? Anything that allows you to engage in social mingling through technology. We know anything that creates opportunities for self-driving vehicles, safely. It may not be in the traffic like a taxi, but probably separate lanes. We know, brick and mortar academe will only be good if they are going to have data science and integrated science and entrepreneurship center and integrate digital humanities and all the other kind of things which are going to make you create value in this new space. this new synergies of value, new synthesis of value. So I'm bullish. I'm completely bullish on how dynamic we are to find new ways to, but the key is to understand what are the trends, because I don't like the conversation about how we are reacting to what has happened. When, truth be told, the smart investors have seen the trends underneath and anticipated that they need to build things to be able to arbitrage and to capture those kinds of risk. So I am bullish on the fact that as long as we understand that changes and disruptive changes have welfare implications, and we need to always make sure we are careful about giving people this opportunity, I am bullish that we will have an economy that will recover and will continue to do wonderful things. I see I've cut out, but I'm just telling you, so to answer your question, I'm bullish.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We're out of time now, but thank you both so much for joining us. And I hope the rest of the semester goes well with regards to remote learning.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yep.
Take care.
Thank you. Have a nice night.
Yep. Bye. Kelly, text me your number.
Okay.